There can be no discussion of desegregation in South Carolina that does not include the merger of SCEA and PEA. In 1967, two separate education organizations, each dedicated to the mission of bringing knowledge and bringing growth and progress for all of South Carolina, overcame enormous difficulties to unify as one, and thus became a transformative component in the history of South Carolina.
The merger of the South Carolina Education Association and the Palmetto Education Association occurred 50 years ago, April 1st, 1967. So we are 50 years removed from one of the most important educational events in the history of South Carolina.
These two organizations made a difference in reference to leading in the charge of desegregating our schools and taking on the leadership of working together and showing that blacks and white educators could come together and work together on behalf of educating our children, elevating our profession, and implementing and initiating education policy and regulation that we are still benefiting from today.
The Palmetto Education Association and the South Carolina Education Association had each served to advance public education in South Carolina for more than 65 years. Palmetto Education Association grew out of the roots of African American teachers' organizations beginning in the 1900s. The organization originating South Carolina Education Association began in 1881. SCEA and PEA began their collaboration and attempts to combine efforts in the early 1950s.
This merger or this unification probably should have taken place dozens of decades ago. I think we go back to Clarendon County in 1950, where they had a case between Briggs and Elliott. That was kind of like a forerunner of the Brown versus Board of Education in '54.
After Brown versus Board, a lot of momentum happened in this country that became known as the Civil Rights Movement. It was the Civil Rights Movement, more than anything else, that changed NEA, and it changed the climate of America, so much so that the Palmetto Education Association and the South Carolina Education Association, as two separate entities, the days were limited.
I guess ever since '54, we should have been thinking about how we can bring all of the elements in our society together and have peace and harmony without discrimination and all the biases and prejudices that, that are still held by many, not only in South Carolina, but elsewhere.
The National Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the game changer for integration. The merger of the South Carolina Education Association and the Palmetto Education Association was a product of the Civil Rights Movement, which integrated public facilities and institutions throughout America.
Dr. Walker Solomon and I, Dr. Solomon was representing the Palmetto Education Association in 1964, and I was representing the old SCEA. When we got back, of course, we were friends and talked professionally off and on anyhow for a long time, but we didn't give any serious effort to this until after that Civil Rights Act of '64. And we got back from that, we started chatting together about what we needed to do to get our communities and our associations to move in this direction without so much discord.
To the credit of the South Carolina Education Association, they were the first state to agree to remove the white-only clause, which they did immediately after the Seattle Convention of 1964. They had no template. They had no blueprint. They were going into the unknown. You had teachers in the same states, in the same counties, who never knew each other, who never socialized with each other, who never by law ate in restaurants with each other, who never drank out of the same water fountains.
I credit the unification of the Palmetto Education Association and the old South Carolina education as being instrumental in bringing this change about, because it set the phase for the county associations to move in that direction, to encourage their local schools and school district administrators to adopt the same kind of thing that we did at the state level and merged in 1967.
But what makes the South Carolina Education Association unification distinct and different is that the impetus of the merger of black and white professionals came from within both organizations, with assistance from the National Education Association and not through pressure from the federal government.
When the merger took place on April 1st, 1967, it was the largest merger of two former segregated associations, organizations in the history of the state of South Carolina. It had an exponential impact. It meant that these teachers would now go back to their school buildings with one brand identity, the South Carolina Education Associations.
Here in the city, DREA had integrated in '68. And it was inevitable because there wasn't any use or sense in having two different organizations under one heading.
After the unification of the organizations in 1967, the South Carolina Education Association had a combined membership of close to 25,000 educators. It represented the largest joining of two professional organizations, one white and one black, in the history of the state.
And from that point on, we had a different image in South Carolina, not only in education, but in the political arena, in the legislature, in the school boards, and the local associations. And we moved rapidly after that merger to work with the local education associations back in the counties to help them bring about an orderly transition in their local areas.
I've had the rare opportunity over the last 49 years to work in various ways in education in South Carolina and around the country. Actually, my first experience in South Carolina happened maybe 1 year after unification, when I became a teacher in a rural school district in the first year of school desegregation. And a group of young black and white teachers got involved right away, proposed major changes to the school and district officials to make desegregation work.
It was very much like I remembered in discussing with one of my mentors, Principal Paul J. Glenn, who's deceased now down in Union County. He recalled how he went as a coach from Sims High School to Union High School in the early days of desegregation, and how he was one of the first black teachers, and he said it was through athletics that we pulled everyone together. And he said it was a team effort, and I liken that to SCEA and PEA coming together as a team effort. It was what would be the best for education in South Carolina, because we knew that there were so many things that we were going to have to deal with coming down the pike. School funding, equitable school funding, school buildings, which we are still dealing with in some areas, such as the I-95 corridor.
Both white and black teachers were transformed by the merger, which was an unprecedented interracial collaboration of highly educated professionals in any field. The merger of PEA and SCEA did more than integrate black and white teachers into one organization. It broke down artificial barriers in unprecedented ways, contributing to remarkable changes in the social fabric and racial etiquette of the state.
One of the first things that impressed me was when we brought the governing bodies, more than just the executive committees, we brought the governing bodies together, and it was like a church picnic. There were people laughing and talking and shaking hands and introducing each other. In fact, as some of us, the officers and some of the staff sat back and said, boy, this is like a church picnic for people getting along together.
And I think as an indicator that the merger was accepted was that I found a brochure that came from 1972. And in every county in South Carolina, either the president or the vice president of every county association, one was white and one was black. So I think that's where the rubber hits the road.
In the early 1980s, the SCEA worked close with Governor Dick Riley's office on the development, passage, and implementation of the Education Improvement Act, which was significant for the history of the SCEA and transformative for education in South Carolina. Because of the Education Improvement Act initiatives and penny increase in the state sales tax to fund it, education progress resulted such as helping keep teachers' salaries at or near the Southeast average, and funding for needed programs still with us today, such as the Teacher Loan Forgiveness Program, Early Child 4-year-old programs, and more. To this day, approximately $600 million for public education continues to come from the EIA penny sales tax.
The Education Improvement Act really made the biggest difference we've ever seen in the state and perhaps in the country in educational gains for young people, teachers, principals, and the state as a whole. Just for example, in the chart I'm showing here, this end of the chart, all the lines are flat. Those were the 10 years before the EIA. And the lines afterwards, the 10 years after, everything's up. Test scores, attendance, teacher support for education. The only thing that went down during the 10 years after the Education Improvement Act is that private school enrollment went down and public school enrollment went up. What a great testimony to the success of all of us in passing the Education Improvement Act, the penny sales tax, but mainly getting educators involved, teachers involved, and making it happen. I think it made teaching and being a principal so much more meaningful.
We got the Education Improvement Act, and we got that funding to help us. And it's still having an impact, and SCEA is still having impact today because of some of those important milestones.
All of this is a result of the merger. And I would like to applaud the South Carolina Education Association 50 years later because they were going into the frontier, a region unknown.
I think knowing that you belong to an organization that is large enough and has enough political clout to change the whole history of how education operates, I think that's very important.
We will continue to advocate for what we feel are in the best interests of educators and students within the state. We are a 3-tiered professional organization, and everything that we do, we have students in the center.
Membership means power, and power means getting things done for the betterment of education.
I was in Woodruff for 4 years, and I transferred to another district, and as soon as I got to that district, Louis Jeter and Hugh Jeter, I call them the Jeter brothers, one's black, one's white, they were both active SCEA members in Union County and were wonderful mentors to me to stay active and as a member in the SCEA and NEA. You have to have those mentors. You have to have people who will pull you in and keep you actively engaged. It is up to the youth to stay engaged, but it's up to us that have been members to be actively engaged and to keep pulling people in. That's my message.
The work of the South Carolina Education Association continues. Once two organizations, separated by race and inequality, but becoming one united and inclusive organization, unswerving in its allegiance to teachers, students, and the public schools in the Palmetto State.